Due Process, winner of 25 regional Emmy Awards, including the 2014 New York Emmys for our coverage of criminal justice and current affairs. Due Process is a presentation of Rutgers School of Law, Newark, and the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy. Studio facilities provided by the Rutgers ITV Studio, Division of Continuing Studies.
Bravo, Frank, for your half-century of service to Rutgers and to the ideal of justice, genuinely equal and accessible to all.
A fond farewell to teaching rarely brings kudos from the nation's highest court. But Frank Askin, though he's leaving the Rutgers Law classroom, is no retiring professor. The dean of New Jersey's Civil Rights Bar, his passion for justice came long before the law. Still, he's leaving his mark on New Jersey law, on how law is taught, and on 50 years of students he inspired. A professor who spent his life defending rights, and the focus of this edition of Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy. Additional funding from the New Jersey State Bar Foundation and the PSEG Foundation, making things better in our communities.
Great civil rights lawyers, great teachers. Sometimes one can be both. Just ask the students and colleagues of Frank Askin. After 50 years on the Rutgers Law faculty, 50 years of public interest law, changing the way law is taught throughout the country, challenging the law in the interest of justice, Frank's about to retire. An exit that has not gone unnoticed here at Due Process, nor at the nation's highest court.
Frank Askin was in the very first class I taught at Rutgers Law School. And as I anticipated, he was first in his graduating class.
By that fall, they were both on the faculty, and Frank was on his way to a 50-year life of teaching, breathing, living the law.
He cared about the right things, and he appreciated that law exists, or should exist, to serve a diverse society.
A commitment that began long before he was a lawyer. By high school, his focus was on social justice and radical left-wing politics.
When I grew up in the late 40s and early 50s, expressing extremist views meant you were for civil rights or against racial discrimination.
So by 18, he had an active FBI file.
I've been battling FBI for more than half a century, and I consider the FBI guidelines something of a charade.
And while the FBI was watching Frank, Frank was on his way to becoming a teacher, an advocate, a man described by colleagues, students, friends, like this.
There hasn't been a time since I have entered the legal profession in which Frank has not been my role model, in what he is my mentor, now my colleague.
Frank is my best friend. He is my mentor. He is my legal partner. He is, my inspiration.
He was my professor. He was my mentor. And he was my friend.
Or, as the ACLU's Ed Barocas puts it,
there are so many ACLU lawyers and civil libertarians generally that have Frank as their idol, and their teacher, their professor, their example of what being a great civil libertarian attorney means.
I vividly recall one day in the late 1960s, after Frank had become my colleague, when he brought a visitor to my office, Mel Wolfe, then legal director of the American Civil Liberties Union. That visit sparked an idea that eventually developed into the ACLU's Women's Rights Project, a venture that consumed my waking hours for the next decade. Frank and I served together for a time as general counsel to the ACLU.
And no one served as long in that post as Frank. So his input's been national, but nowhere greater than here at home.
We have here in New Jersey the strongest protections for freedom of speech, and that is because of Frank Askin.
Among other things, his opening up regional shopping malls in New Jersey to political petitioning.
The Paradigm public place is clearly taken over what was once the town square or the village green in most parts of our state.
The leafleting case was a Frank success, but even when he lost,
If you're doing it right, you shouldn't always win.
he left an impression.
This case concerns a most fundamental issue of contemporary American society: the right of racial minorities to participate fully and effectively in the political process.
That was an appeal to end the ban on felon voting, with Frank as comfortable in the courtroom as in the classroom.
This was 25, 30 years ago.
Even when it was the state Supreme Court or the nation's highest court, or even, close to home, an early fight on behalf of Newark's black cops.
The police officers right here, no, we thought we were being treated in a racist manner.
So you find Frank?
We find Frank. Frank listened, and he decided to help us. He filed suit, and eventually we won.
Claude Coleman went on to be a lawyer, the director of police, and ultimately a Superior Court judge.
I was the only person that was a student of his, a client of his, and also a defendant, because he ends up suing me later on as head of the police department.
Everything he does is cleared with, he clearly does with the underlying assumption that injustice has to be fixed. It's not a question of whether he's able to or whether this is practical. It just has to be done.
That's what led him to a couple of stints on the Hill and 2 unsuccessful congressional campaigns.
I'm Frank Askin, and I'm asking for your votes.
But always returning to the law school, a base where lawyers like the iconic Arthur Kanoy and his dear friend Frank Askin could teach and try to change the world.
He is a firm believer that if the law is on your side, you can move mountains, and if the law is not on your side, then one should move mountains to change the law to do justice.
And so he began enlisting students to help.
So you think it's a freedom of the press issue?
I do.
And created a constitutional litigation clinic, a critical addition to Rutgers, and a model for law schools all over the country.
Very often law schools focus on describing what the law is. He focused on, and our clinic focused on, what the law can be.
Content discrimination angle, they can ban all journalists, but you can't ban specific journalists.
It's possible.
A place where students can go hands-on in the interest of civil rights.
I'm also thinking in terms of door-to-door canvassing and like freedom of speech infringements there.
And social justice.
Frank's pitch about his clinic is it's a course where students don't just study the law, they make the law. And then he amplifies on that at his first class where he says, you know, in most of the curriculum, what you're doing is you're looking at the law as it is, and you're asking the question why. But in this clinic, I want you to look at the law as it never was and ask why not.
So it's only fitting that what's grown to be an entire wing of Rutgers clinics will be named for Frank and for his wife of more than 50 years, the former Marilyn Klein. Like Frank, a former journalist, a lawyer, and a legal pioneer in the field of elder law.
She is a lion in her own right. Her work on elder law is some of the most important here in New Jersey.
She taught the course in elder law here for many, many years. That was very well received. And as she predicted, it has become a very discrete and important area of practice.
She essentially created the field of elder law. And as the baby boomer population continues to age, they will have the legal protections that are available to them courtesy of Marilyn Askin.
Marilyn is smart, outspoken, determined, like Frank, whose last weeks as the law school's most senior professor found him slower in body, but not in mind, doing what he's done for more than 50 years.
Residents of these private communities have rights under the state constitution, the only state in the nation.
Question, challenge, teach.
Those are a little uncertain.
Bravo, Frank, for your half-century of service to Rutgers and to the ideal of justice, genuinely equal and accessible to all. May you continue to advance that ideal in your life's next chapter.
Frank Askin, that is one hell of a send-off.
I'm overwhelmed.
Welcome to Due Process. Let me ask you about Justice Ginsburg. When you were in her class, 53 years ago, you walked into her class.
Right.
Was she a great teacher? She's been a great justice.
Yes and no. She was encyclopedic. She knew everything. But she was, most of the students found her boring. She's taught in a monologue. She sat at her desk and really taught the monologue. And a lot of it was over the students. Now, I was an older student. I had spent 10 years, the previous 10 years, as a newspaper reporter. It was easy for me. I'd covered courts, I'd covered politics, I knew the legal procedures.
So I can imagine a dialogue between the two of you.
The class was a dialogue between me and Ruth. The other students, they were totally lost. But Ruth and I had fun.
And did you think 53 years ago that you'd still be at Rutgers Law School 53 years later?
No. I found a home there that was totally stroke of luck.
Let's talk about your perhaps biggest claim to fame, which is the legal clinic.
Right.
We take it for granted now in law schools?
Yes.
Wasn't always so.
No. I created the first, there were legal clinics before my constitutional litigation clinic around the country, but they were service clinics. Landlord-tenant, consumers, domestic relations. I wanted to do a law reform clinic. And, you know, I was sort of my mentor was Arthur Kenoy, a great civil rights teacher. And I got Arthur agreed that I should set up this clinic in civil liberties law. He did a seminar. He didn't want to do a clinic. I created the clinic. In fact, what I did, I turned my hobby into my vocation. Starting in 1967 with the Newark riots, I was doing just a traditional law school teacher, but I became a volunteer lawyer for the ACLU in New Jersey. And my students would volunteer to work with me. And we did a lot of litigation over the civil disorders in 67 and 68. This was on my spare time. And I decided, well, I'm going to make this my full-time academic activity. I wanted to create this clinic. So we created the first law reform clinic in the country in 1970.
With the idea, Frank, of, as somebody said in the tape piece, not just studying the law, learning the law, but changing the law?
Changing the law. Let me tell you, the first two cases on my docket when I started the clinic was government surveillance of political activists and why it violated the First Amendment, and police profiling on the highways.
I remember that.
So you might say everything old is new again. These are still relevant issues. Government surveillance and police profiling.
Okay, so let's talk about government surveillance.
Right.
Because you were the subject
That's right.
of government surveillance, starting when you were a teenager.
When I was 16 years old, right. I was a community organizer in my native Baltimore, which was a Jim Crow city, and I was fighting racial segregation. And in the late 1960s, that was not politically correct.
You were also, Frank, involved with serious left-wing politics.
Yes, and well, serious. I mean,
I mean, enough so that you would
Yeah.
get the FBI's attention.
That's right, but largely most of it had to do with civil rights activity and opposing segregation.
But it was enough to get you that massive file. So how, let me ask you, years later, do you manage to, say, get admitted to the bar?
Okay.
Not get caught up in the McCarthy stuff?
Right. Well, as a matter of fact, I did for a while, and that's what happened. As a kid, I always thought I was going to go to law school. But once the FBI started following me around and creating a dossier on me, I realized that J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI are never going to allow me to be admitted to the bar. So after 1 year of college, I dropped out. And it wasn't until 10 years later, the McCarthy era was over, the whole Red Scare was behind us, and suddenly it occurred, yeah, I could probably get admitted to the bar now. But I only had 1 year of college. So I had to start going back to school. And I started going to CCNY to pick up credits.
But you didn't have a bachelor's degree when you went to Rutgers Law School.
No,
How the hell did that happen?
Well, I finally picked up another 2 years worth of credits at City College with a year I had from Baltimore. So I now had 3 years of college, 96 credits. And a mutual friend, who was actually a member of the Rutgers Board of Governors, and I knew through various activities in Bergen County. For a while, I was the executive director of the Democratic Party in Bergen County in the first Dick Hughes campaign. And a mutual friend took me to lunch with Willard Heckel, the dean at Rutgers Law School.
Remember him well.
And I'd already taken the LSAT, and I had a good score on the LSAT. Willard learned about my background, and he said, "Oh, we'll admit you to Rutgers," because no other law school would. In fact, I was looking for an evening law school. At the time, Rutgers didn't have an evening law school. The only evening law schools were Columbia and Seton Hall, and they would not admit me without a degree. And Willard says, "Oh, we'll admit you." And suddenly, I've discovered I'm going to law school full-time while raising a young family.
Mm-hmm.
And
you worked
yeah.
and went to law school and had your family. Is that
That's right. Well, what happened was every day, I'd go to law school all day, and Marilyn would pack me 3 or 4 sandwiches for the day to eat lunch, and then at 5:30, I went over to the Newark Star Ledger and worked till midnight on the Star Ledger copy desk. And I would eat my dinner with the other sandwiches that Marilyn had packed me, and then I'd get home about 12:30, and I was up again at 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning to go back to law school.
And you still graduated first in your class?
Yes, I did. But I'd say as an older student, law school came basically easy to me. I think that's true.
We heard your colleagues, students, friends talking about you always coming back to the same word, mentor.
Mm-hmm.
So who were your mentors?
By
whom were you inspired?
Well, Arthur it was my basic mentor.
A great civil rights lawyer as well as teacher.
And Ruth Ginsburg was a mentor. After I graduated, starting in 1966, Ruth and I were the 2 civil procedure teachers at the law school. I was teaching civil procedure. And she was my mentor. And until she left the law school around 1970, went off to Columbia, she and I were the 2 civil procedure teachers. So I was always sort of, at Ruth's feet, understanding all the activities of civil procedure.
What about Justice Brennan? We had you on this show, I don't know how long ago, at least 10 years ago, talking about Justice Brennan, and you declared that he not only was a great justice, but that he was the greatest justice, and not just of the 20th century. So tell me about that.
I think he was the greatest justice we ever had. He was a man with tremendous vision, with tremendous sympathy for the poor, the needy, the oppressed, great sympathy for constitutional rights. And one thing Justice Brennan taught me, he wrote a law review article 30 years ago in the Harvard Law Review that said, you got to start looking to state constitutions. Don't come to us. The U.S. Supreme Court is not the friend of civil liberties.
And that is what you did.
And that's what I did. I dropped out of basically the federal courts and turned my attention to litigating in the New Jersey courts and under the state constitution. and expanding rights under the New Jersey Constitution. And it was Justice Brennan who inspired me to do that.
Give me a quick laundry list, if you will, of the kinds of cases that got to the state Supreme Court that Frank Askin and his students did.
Well, I'm trying to even remember what the first one was. One was the shopping center case. I can't remember if that was the first one.
Mm-hmm.
But we succeeded in having New Jersey rule that the suburban shopping malls were free speech forums. No other states had done that. Well, California had done that a little bit. New Jersey became the strongest state for protecting free speech and petitioning at these suburban shopping malls. That was a big victory. After that, I turned my attention in part, well, we had done other cases in the meantime, but I turned my attention to rights of homeowners in what we call common interest communities. Homeowners associations, condominiums, property owners associations. These are mini governments, but in every other state they're considered private property. And as far as the federal Constitution is concerned, they are private property and there are no rights under the federal Constitution. Well, we created rights under the New Jersey Constitution for these people, particularly rights of free speech and free and open elections. And that has been a great, New Jersey is still the only state that does that residents of these communities have constitutional rights against their private governing boards.
The New Jersey Supreme Court has always been known as a very special institution, taking on cases and making decisions that might not have happened in another state. There's been a lot of hue and cry over the years of the Christie administration about what's happened to the court and the pressure and the political pressure on the court. How do you read that? How do you see it?
I think the New Jersey Supreme Court is still probably the best Supreme Court in the country. It has withstood the so-called Christie revolution. First of all, he was sort of pushed into reappointing Stuart Rabner as Chief Justice, and Rabner's been a great Chief Justice in the tradition of Robert Wilentz and Dick Hughes and Deborah Porritz and the brief reign of Jim Zazali. We've had great Chief Justices in this state for almost 50 years, and they have really molded this court into a real protector of civil liberties and civil rights and rights of the poor. I mean, one area nobody pays a lot of attention to, under the federal Constitution, people have no rights against these boilerplate contracts they sign where they waive all their rights. They waive their right to sue, they waive their right to jury trial. In the small print in these 40-page contracts, they're waiving rights. Can't do that in New Jersey. New Jersey doesn't allow it. New Jersey says if you're going to waive rights, it's got to be in huge print where everybody understands it and signs that they read this print and know what they're signing. That doesn't happen in other states. So New Jersey has been a very forward-looking court, and even under the Christie administration. I think he's made decent appointments. I think Ann Patterson is she was his first appointment. I think she's a terrific justice. And his other appointments have been perfectly fine. So we still have a court that's pretty unanimous on most issues. They've backed down a little bit in the criminal law area. That they've done. But another, on questions of social justice and civil liberties, this court is probably as strong as it ever was.
Frank, with only about a minute left, let me ask you quickly, the clinic wing where you work, which has grown from very small to very big, will now be named not just for Frank Askin, but for Marilyn Askin as well. What about that? How does that make you feel, and why is Marilyn in there?
Because Marilyn has been very much a part of this whole process. First of all, she taught elder law at the law school for 28 years. We have contributed a lot of money to the Frank and Marilyn Askin Clinical Fund, which with outside matching contributions is now almost $1 million.
Amazing.
And Marilyn has been a terrific part of that and has pursued, has been very important in our doing this. And she's as much a part of this tradition that we've created as anybody else.
Frank, thank you for your friendship over the years to due process. Thank you for this talk today. When Frank Askin talks, we always listen. But that's it for this edition of Due Process. For Ray Brown, who had this one off, for producer Tanya Bentley and director Laurel Spira, I'm Sandra King. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
Since after 9/11, we had some 1,200 people of Arab descent who were held for periods of up to a year without any hearings, in secret. I think there is plenty of power that exists within the governmental intelligence agencies now to combat terrorism without having to do away with due process, without the need for secret evidence, secret hearings, secret detention, secret wiretapping. Now, these are perilous times. Nobody denies that. There are people who want to do us great harm, and there are really needs for national security provisions, but we have to balance that against our traditions of individual liberty in this country. We can't become a police state just in order to protect ourselves from the bad guys. When you have a police state, there's less crime, but there's also no liberty, and we have to have a balance here.
Want even more insight on law and justice? Become a fan of Due Process on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter and watch us on demand on YouTube.